Welcome to the Curtin University Oil and Gas Innovation Center and its seminar series on decommissioning. My name is Klaus Otto and I'm the director of the center. We will start with a series with a presentation about the regulatory aspects and challenges of decommissioning of oil and gas infrastructure offshore Australia. It is my pleasure to introduce Ineke Rebos of Theology Energy and Dean Stewart of Sequent Consulting. Both are adjunct research fellows with the center. For any comments or questions, you can contact either Ineke, Dean, or myself. Our contacts details are provided on the slides. Please note that this video podcast is intended for commentary and general information only. A Curtin University note and disclaimer is provided on the last slide. I will now hand over to Ineke and Dean, and please enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, Klaus, for the introduction. Now, we know that once an offshore asset is decommissioned, whether that be on the UK continental shelf or offshore Western Australia, the expectation or base case is that everything should be removed and a clear seabed left. So if I told you that much of the infrastructure that is used in the extraction of oil and gas offshore is left in place, would that surprise you? Well, it surprised me, given that the default position is everything needs to be removed. I'm Ineke Rebos and I specialise in the commercial and regulatory compliance aspects of decommissioning.
And I'm Dean Stewart and I specialise in decommissioning program management, technical, commercial and regulatory compliance.
Together we will share with you our passion and insights into the many interesting and evolving aspects of decommissioning.
Ineke, can you explain why now these redundant structures and pipelines can be left in place or decommissioned at sea?
Sure. Well, let's start with the UK, which is primarily governed by OSPAR and OSPAR Decision 98.3. Here, the topsides must be removed and wells permanently abandoned, which requires plugging and wellhead removal. For jackets or substructures, less full removal is permitted under a derogation if they're either steel and weigh more than 10,000 tons in air and were installed before the 9th of February 1999, or are concrete, or are a disused offshore structure which has suffered some unforeseen structural damage or deterioration to the extent that its removal presents significant difficulties. An example of this would be Piper Alpha.
So it sounds like the category of derogations have been born out of the difficulty in removing these large substructures.
That's correct, that's it exactly. Derogations are considered on a case-by-case basis and will only be granted if there are significant reasons why an alternative disposal option is preferable to the reuse or recycling or the final disposal on land. Now, I should mention about subsea pipelines that there are no international guidelines on the decommissioning of disused pipelines. Instead, the UK's base case is complete removal of the pipelines and the pipelines' protective deposits, and that's to allow a clear seabed. A comparative assessment is required where less than full removal is proposed for the pipeline and its protective structures like the rock dumping or the mattresses.
What about Australia then? Does everything need to be removed?
Well, for Australia, as far as international obligations go on decommissioning, Australia isn't a party to OSPAR, but Australia has ratified UNCLOS and the London Convention, and this draws in the IMO guidelines. These international obligations require, as a base case or default position, the complete removal of property and the plugging and abandonment of wells. Australia's international obligation is reflected in Australia's Offshore Petroleum and Greenhouse Gas Act, or the OPGGS. Now, what that means is the default requirement for offshore petroleum infrastructure in the Commonwealth waters is that the property must be completely removed and the wells plugged and abandoned. However, under OPGGS section 270, arrangements other than full removal may be permitted if satisfactory to NOPSEMA. And this is reinforced under the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources Decommissioning Guideline. And I'll read the section for you. Options other than complete removal may be considered whereby the title holder must demonstrate that the alternative decommissioning approach delivers equal or better environmental, safety and well integrity outcomes compared to complete removal. And that the approach complies with all other legislative and regulatory requirements. So in Australia, less than full removal will be considered, but the assessment must clearly demonstrate how the company will reduce the risks to as low as is reasonably practicable or a LARP.
So, okay, then to summarise, in Australia, the base case is full removal, but less than complete removal of property is potentially possible, subject to demonstrating a LARP, compliance with the regulations, and of course, NOPSEMA acceptance.
Yep, that's it in a nutshell. So, Dean, it's probably worthwhile explaining what a LARP means and how do you demonstrate that your preferred decommissioning solution is a LARP?
Yeah, okay. The Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources has, in their decommissioning guidelines, states that the company must show through reasoned and supported arguments that there are no other practical measures that could be reasonably taken to reduce the risks further. NOPSEMA also outlines the same requirements in its definition of a LARP, and it is generally accepted that risks are generally considered to be reduced to a LARP when the costs of reducing risks further are considered grossly disproportionate to the level of the risk reduction actually achieved.
Okay, so pipeline cleanliness levels is a really good example of this. So whether a pipeline is to be removed or decommissioned in situ, it must be thoroughly cleaned to ensure that the pollutants are not released to the environment in unacceptable quantities. Now, the OSPAR performance standard, which applies to the UK, obviously, their standard is 30 milligrams per litre of oil in produced water discharged to the sea. So when pipelines were flushed as part of the decommissioning of the Murchison field, the operator achieved a level of 40 milligrams per litre. Now, they found that there was actually no further benefit could be gained from performing successive flushing, so they actually stopped at that level. The cost and the resources required to actually reduce that oil in discharged water level further would have actually been grossly disproportionate to the level of risk reduction that could have actually been achieved.
That's correct. And one option is to use a comparative assessment to demonstrate that all feasible decommissioning and removal options have been considered, and to compare the risks and impacts of the compared options. In fact, CAs are the method prescribed by UNCLOS and the IMO. NOPSEMA does not mandate the use of comparative assessments. However, its recently released policy, Section 572, Maintenance and Removal of Property, indicates that a CA may be used to support alternative arrangements in the EP, but does not replace the requirement of the EP or the regulations. The comparative assessment process enables an objective and transparent assessment of a number of different decommissioning options, and through reasoned argument, scientific evidence helps you to assess and determine the optimal overall decommissioning option. It's a robust, reliable, and consistent assessment process, and ultimately provides the basis and justification to stakeholders and regulators for the proposed decommissioning option. Currently, there are no Australian guidelines for the use of comparative assessments, but I understand something is being developed by APIA, and in the interim, the UK guidelines are a good reference point.
So the comparative assessment has a key function to play in the decommissioning approvals process.
Yes, the CA supports the environmental plan for the proposed decommissioning option, which requires NOPSEMA's acceptance.
Okay, so can you explain to us what's involved in the comparative assessment process, please?
The process itself is broken into 6 steps. However, I will stress that the quality of the CA is a reflection of the level of engagement with stakeholders, the timely commencement of the process, and of course the quality of the research and the data actually used. So it is a bit of an oversimplification when I say it's just a 6-step process.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
Okay, step 1 then is scoping. This is where we establish the terms of reference. This is where you start by defining the scope and boundaries, what is in your CA, what is out, the period it actually covers, who the stakeholders are who will need to be engaged, and you also importantly need to define the actual evaluation criteria and the relative weightings of the criteria.
Okay, so in this part, this is where you set out what's in and what's out of scope, and then who needs to be consulted.
Absolutely. Now, step 2, this is where you identify the alternative and screen out any unfeasible options. You will be left with a short list of feasible options for more detailed evaluation. Now, step 3 is our preparation step, and this is where the bulk of the work occurs. Here we need to identify information and data required to support the evaluations, what studies, technical, environmental, safety, and research that needs to be undertaken to be able to evaluate the options properly. We need to perform the studies, the research, and also start engaging the stakeholders.
Okay, so just referring back to our discussion on ALARP, I take it that the information and the data in this part of the process, this is what's going to support the ALARP principles and process.
Yes, absolutely. And this stage can take years to complete. Now, step 4 is the actual mechanical evaluation stage. This is where you evaluate the options. You use the data and outputs from the industry norms, your research from step 3 and the studies, your input from stakeholders, and then to test the emerging results, it is prudent to perform a sensitivity analysis to see if the results are unduly influenced in any way by any one particular criteria. Now, step 5, that's our recommendation. This is where we explain the output from the evaluation, what our final recommendation is, and any trade-offs that have been made. And finally, step 6, verify the contents of the CA. We need to do this with a third party. We need to review the results, the recommendations, and the trade-offs with internal and external stakeholders. And we need to do this before a submission to the regulator to support the permissioning documents.
Thank you for that. Now, we don't have time today to cover any of the process in detail or the learnings, but if people are interested to find out more about derogations or comparative assessments, what is available for them?
Well, listeners, Ineke and I have created, in conjunction with Curtin University, a series of short modules on decommissioning. We have a specific module on comparative assessment, which will be available online end of Q2, which you can sign up to via Curtin University, and you can collect CPD points for it. Alternatively, you can contact either myself directly through Sequent Consulting or Ineke through Teleology Energy.
Well, listeners, we will be uploading more short podcasts with Curtin on a variety of engineering, compliance and commercial topics, including environmental principles relevant to decommissioning, technology, residual liability and structural removal methods. So please join us again, and please leave feedback and suggestions for any future podcasts you'd like to hear. Thank you.